The air was thick with the aroma of roasted lamb, fresh bread, and aged wine, yet I could barely stomach the sight of the grand feast laid out before me. Golden candlesticks flickered with soft flames, casting elongated shadows across the sprawling oak dining table, their wax dripping lazily onto silver trays. My fingers tightened around the fabric of my dress as I sat at the far end of the extravagant dining table, a place that had always felt more like a prison than a home. My father, William Montclair, the self-proclaimed king of our family, lifted his wine glass, the dim candlelight flickering against his cruel, calculating eyes. The engraved crest on his ring gleamed as he swirled the deep red liquid, an indulgent smirk playing on his lips. His presence alone was enough to silence a room, and tonight his target was me. A slow, deliberate smirk formed on his lips before he spoke, voice sharp as a blade. "Let's toast, shall we?" he said, raising his glass. "To my son, Nathan, who continues to make this family proud with his business achievements." A chorus of applause followed, glasses clinking in agreement. The scent of roasted garlic and rosemary drifted through the air, but the taste in my mouth was bitter. I sat motionless, my fingers clenched in my lap, and my father continued, "To my daughter, Vivian." His voice dipped into something bitter, mocking, who, despite all the opportunities handed to her, has achieved absolutely nothing. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. My mother, ever the obedient wife, cast her eyes downward, pretending not to hear. The diamond pendant at her neck sparkled under the chandelier's glow, but her expression remained as dull and lifeless as the portraits hanging along the walls. My brother, Nathan, scoffed into his drink, the ice clinking against the glass. My aunts and uncles shifted in their seats, some amused, others unwilling to intervene. I felt a sharp sting in my chest, but I refused to let it show. My father chuckled. "What is it now, Vivian? Do you still believe you'll make something of yourself, living in that tiny apartment, working odd jobs?" He shook his head, his voice laced with disdain. "You are a disgrace to this family. You will never make us proud." Heat rushed to my face, my breath uneven. I wanted to scream, to lash out, but I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. I stood, chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. "Someday," I said, my voice unwavering, "you're going to regret every single word." My father only laughed. "That will be the day hell freezes over." I turned and walked out of that house, not looking back. They thought they had crushed me, but they had no idea what was coming. The cold air stung my face as I stepped outside, my heels clicking against the pavement. The wind carried the scent of distant rain, and the streets were slick from an earlier downpour. My father's words echoed in my head, each syllable a fresh wound. I had nothing, no savings, no real job, and no one on my side. My apartment was barely livable, my fridge empty except for expired yogurt and half a loaf of stale bread. I pulled my phone from my bag, the screen cracked from a previous fall, staring at the contacts list. Then my eyes landed on one name, Aunt Margaret. She was the only one in my family who had ever treated me with kindness. My father despised her for it, often referring to her as the black sheep for choosing independence over blind obedience to the Montclair name. Taking a shaky breath, I typed, "Aunt Margaret, I need help. Seconds later, my phone buzzed. "Come home, Vivian. I've been waiting for this day." Aunt Margaret's home was nothing like my father's mansion. It was warm, inviting. The scent of lavender and vanilla lingered in the air, and the walls weren't filled with lifeless portraits of ancestors, but with pictures of her travels, memories she had made on her own terms. A fireplace crackled in the corner, casting golden light over the shelves lined with books and trinkets from around the world. She sat across from me, studying me with kind, piercing eyes. "I knew this day would come," she said softly, wrapping her fingers around a steaming cup of tea. "Your father, he was never going to support you." I clenched my jaw. "He thinks I'm worthless." She reached across the table, squeezing my hand. "He's a fool." A bit of silence stretched between us before she leaned back with a knowing smile. "Vivian, there's something you don't know." I frowned. "What?" She exhaled slowly, choosing her words carefully. "I have built something outside of this family's influence, an empire of my own." I blinked, my heart pounding. "What do you mean?" Her lips curved into a soft smile. "I mean, I am a billionaire, Vivian. And since I have no children, I have decided that my entire fortune will be yours." The world seemed to tilt. My breath hitched. What?" She chuckled, her eyes twinkling. "You heard me. Everything I own, my company, my assets, it's all yours." I sat there stunned. My father had spent his whole life chasing wealth, belittling me for not being successful. But I was now set to inherit more than he could ever dream of. And suddenly, an idea took root. I wouldn't use this money for revenge. No, I would destroy his expectations of me by proving that I was more powerful than he ever imagined. 1 month later, I walked into the towering Montclair Enterprises building. The high ceilings loomed above me, the scent of polished wood and expensive cologne filling the air. The receptionist did a double take, her mouth slightly open. "Miss Sellen?" I smiled, setting down a folder. "Tell my father the new owner is here to see him." Minutes later, I stood in the boardroom, my father and brother frozen in their seats. What is that? What is this?" My father stammered, his grip tightening on the armrests of his chair. I slid the ownership documents across the table. "I just bought out every major share of Montclair Enterprises." I leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "I own your company now." His face turned white. My brother's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking at the corner. I smirked. "Who's worthless now?" My father's lips moved, but no words came out. His fingers trembled as he reached for the documents I had just slid across the glossy boardroom table. My brother, Nathan, sat stiffly beside him, his knuckles white against the armrests of his chair. I crossed my arms, watching them scan the paperwork, every signature, every acquisition, every legal confirmation that this company, their legacy, now belonged to me. "This is a joke," my father finally managed to croak out, flipping through the pages. "No," I replied smoothly, tilting my head. "This is reality." He lifted his gaze to meet mine, and for the first time in my life, I saw it, fear. The all-powerful William Montclair, the man who had ridiculed me, crushed me, humiliated me in front of our entire family, was afraid of me. His fingers twitched slightly, against the polished wood of the boardroom table. And in that moment, it was more satisfying than any revenge I had ever dreamed of. My father's voice wavered as he spoke. "Where did you get this kind of money?" I smiled, slow and deliberate, the soft hum of the city skyline visible beyond the towering glass windows. "Let's just say someone believed in me. Unlike you." Nathan scoffed, shaking his head. "You can't seriously think you can run this company." He leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table, his cufflinks glinting under the harsh boardroom lights. "You've never even stepped into the corporate world. You don't know the first thing about running an empire. Neither did you, Nathan." I shot back, my nails tapping idly against the smooth surface. "Dad handed you everything on a silver platter, didn't he? You never had to fight for anything." His mouth pressed into a thin line, but I continued. "I, on the other hand, know what it's like to build from nothing." I rested my palms on the table, staring directly at my father, the weight of years of dismissal and mockery pressing down. "And I know exactly what this company needs." My father's jaw tightened. "And what's that?" I smirked. "A leader who understands real struggle, someone who values people instead of treating them like expendable tools." Nathan scoffed again. "You're delusional." I leaned back, the chair creaking slightly. "No, I'm just better than you." Silence. Thick, suffocating silence. And then my father stood abruptly, his chair scraping back against the marble floor. His face was red, his chest heaving with unspoken rage, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. "This isn't over," he seethed, voice rough like gravel. I simply smiled, glancing at the ownership document still resting between us. "Oh, but it is, because for the first time I held all the power, and they both knew it." I spent the next few weeks diving deep into the company's records, and what I found made my stomach turn. The numbers told a story of greed, of backroom deals, and quiet betrayals. The Montclair Empire had been built on a foundation of lies and exploitation. Corruption. My father and Nathan had bled this company dry: underpaid employees, unethical business practices, embezzlement. It was all there, buried in numbers, hidden behind fake reports and loopholes. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about cleaning up the mess they had created and making something better. I called for an emergency board meeting, much to my father's horror. He was still technically a shareholder, though his control had been stripped away. The conference room smelled of fresh coffee and polished mahogany, but beneath it lingered something heavier, the tension of power shifting hands. "This is an outrage," he bellowed as he stormed into the conference room, Nathan trailing behind him. His usually pristine suit was slightly disheveled, a stark contrast to his usual unshakable presence. "You don't have the authority to." "I have every bit of authority." I cut him off, gesturing to the papers in front of me. "Now sit down." His face turned an even deeper shade of red, but he did sit, his hands gripping the armrests as though to keep himself grounded. I turned to the rest of the board members, some of whom had always been loyal to my father. They looked uncertain now, their gazes flickering between me and him, waiting for a show of strength. I gave them exactly that. "We are cleaning house," I announced, my voice steady. "Effective immediately. All illegal activities, all unethical business practices, And today, one of the board members hesitated. Miss Montclair, do you really think? I don't think, I interrupted. I know. This company has been built on the suffering of employees. That ends now. I turned back to my father, watching his face contort with barely contained rage, the deep lines on his face stark under the overhead lights. This company will become something better, something real. And you, I tilted my head, my voice calm yet firm, will watch as I fix everything you destroyed. His fingers curled into fists, but there was nothing he could do because this was my company now, and I was going to fix it. Over the next few months, I made drastic changes. I doubled salaries for underpaid employees. I restructured policies to ensure ethical treatment in every sector. I personally oversaw layoffs of executives who had been involved in shady dealings, including some of my father's closest allies. And I made sure to hire people who actually needed work, not just people with fancy connections. My father watched it all unfold from the sidelines, powerless. And when employees started calling me the best CEO the company had ever had, he knew he had lost. I was in my office late one evening when I heard a knock at the door. The city skyline glittered behind me, casting reflections against the glass. I looked up to find my father standing there, not as the arrogant, untouchable businessman he once was, but as a man who had lost everything. I leaned back in my chair, fingers resting lightly on the polished desk. To what do I owe the pleasure? He hesitated, then stepped inside, closing the door behind him. For the first time, there was no malice in his eyes, no contempt, only regret. I was wrong about you, he admitted, voice low. I I should have believed in you. A part of me had waited my whole life to hear those words, but now they meant nothing. I studied him for a long moment before speaking. I didn't need you to be proud of me, I said, my voice measured. I just needed you to believe I was capable. His shoulders sagged, the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him in a way no amount of wealth could fix. And now? He asked, voice barely above a whisper. I exhaled slowly, glancing at the city beyond. Now, I don't need anything from you. He flinched just slightly, and for the first time in my life, he was the one feeling powerless. My father had always been a titan of control, a man whose very presence commanded fear and obedience. But now he looked small as he sat across from me in my office, the soft glow of the city skyline casting long shadows over the polished mahogany desk between us. I studied the way his shoulders slumped, how his once powerful voice had lost its edge. The tailored suit he wore, once a symbol of his authority, now looked ill-fitting, as if the weight of his downfall had shrunk him. There was no arrogance in his posture, no smug superiority. He was nothing like the man who had humiliated me in front of our family all those months ago. I should have felt satisfaction, but instead I felt nothing. Do you regret it? I finally asked, watching him carefully. His finger twitched against the armrest of the chair, his gaze dropping to the floor. The overhead lights buzzed softly, filling the silence. I was a fool, he muttered. I thought power made me invincible. I thought. He swallowed, rubbing a hand over his face, his eyes momentarily flickering with something I couldn't quite place. I thought you were weak because you refused to play by my rules. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk, fingers steepled together. And now, his throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. Now I see that you were stronger than I ever was. His words should have meant something to me. Once upon a time, I would have killed to hear my father admit he was wrong. But now it was too late. I don't need your validation, Dad, I said quietly, my voice measured and calm. Not anymore. He looked at me then, something breaking in his eyes, the dim lighting accentuating the deep lines on his face. I know. Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating, the weight of everything left unsaid hanging in the air. I should have thrown him out, should have told him that he meant nothing to me now. But despite everything, I had never wanted to become him. And so I didn't. Instead, I exhaled slowly, my voice steady. There's still time for you to change, to be someone better. His lips parted slightly, as if shocked that I wasn't finishing him off like he once would have done to me. And with that, I turned my chair away, facing the window, letting the conversation end there, because I had already won. And he knew it. If I thought my father's defeat had been satisfying, my brother's downfall was even better. Nathan had spent his entire life looking down on me. He had been my father's favorite, the one who could do no wrong. He had laughed when I was humiliated, had sneered at my struggles, had enjoyed every moment of my suffering. So when I took control of Montclair Enterprises, his fury was delicious. He stormed into my office one evening, slamming the door behind him. The sound reverberated against the glass walls. "This isn't over," he snarled, his face flushed with anger. I sighed, rubbing my temples. "Nathan, it's been over since the day I walked in here and took your throne." His hands clenched into fists, veins visible beneath his skin. "You have no idea what you're doing, Vivian. You think running a company is about playing the hero," he scoffed, shaking his head. "You'll fail, and when you do, I'll be right here to clean up the mess." I leaned back in my chair, the leather cool against my skin, giving him a slow, deliberate smile. "Oh, Nathan," I said softly, tilting my head. "I'm not going to fail." His jaw clenched. "You have no real experience. You're a joke in the business world." "Really?" I cut in. "Then why has our stock gone up 30 since I took over? Why are employees finally speaking up about the corruption you and Dad ignored? Why are we making actual profits instead of bleeding money from unethical deals?" His face burned red, but I wasn't done. "You weren't born to be a leader, Nathan. You were born to be a leader, Nathan. You were handed everything and still managed to fail." Meanwhile, I had nothing. And look at me now. I watched as realization flickered in his eyes, the weight of truth pressing down on him. For the first time in his life, he had lost, and I had won. Winning should have felt more satisfying. But as I walked through the halls of Montclair Enterprises, watching employees smile as they passed me, something they never did when my father and brother were in charge, I realized something important. This was never about revenge. It was about proving that power didn't have to be cruel. Under my father's rule, this company had been built on fear. People had been scared to speak up, terrified of losing their jobs. There had been corruption, greed, and ruthless business deals that crushed small companies beneath their feet. I wouldn't run my empire like that. I wanted something better, something my father could never build. So instead of focusing on destroying them, I focused on lifting others up. I doubled salaries for lower level employees. I created mentorship programs for young women in business. I funded scholarships for students who had been told they would never amount to anything because I knew what it was like to be told I was worthless. And now I was in a position to change lives. The news spread like wildfire, headlines flashing across financial media outlets. Under new leadership, Montclair Enterprises becomes a symbol of change. Ex-CEO William Montclair and his downfall from grace. Vivian Montclair, the woman who built a new legacy. For the first time, the name Montclair wasn't synonymous with corruption and cruelty. It was synonymous with justice. And my father, he had to watch it all unfold, every headline, every article, every news segment. His company, his empire, was now known for something he never valued, integrity. And that was a better revenge than I ever could have dreamed of. The boardroom was silent as I entered, my heels clicking against the marble floor. Every executive seated at the long table turned to face me, their expressions ranging from cautious respect to barely concealed doubt. For years, these men had served my father, bowing to his every demand, turning a blind eye to his unethical practices. They had watched him strip this company of its integrity and let Nathan get away with whatever he pleased. But those days were over. I was in charge now. I placed my hands on the table, scanning their faces before speaking. There are going to be some changes, I said, my voice even but firm. The way things have been run in the past, that ends today. A man near the middle, an older executive who had worked under my father for years, cleared his throat. Miss Montclair, if I may know, I cut in sharply. You may not. His mouth snapped shut. I know what you're about to say, I continued. This is how it's always been done. This is how it's always been done. This is the way things work. I leaned forward, my gaze unwavering. But let me be perfectly clear. I do not care how things have been done. Silence, the weight of my words, settled over the room. And I care about ethics. My voice never wavered. This company will no longer be built on exploitation and intimidation. We will be different. We will be different. One of the executives, a younger man who had been skeptical of my leadership from the start, frowned. And what if we disagree? I gave him a cold smile. Then you're free to leave. A ripple of tension moved through the room. For the first time, they understood I wasn't here to ask for respect. I was here to command it. And they could either get on board with my vision or get out. Not everyone was pleased with my leadership. I expected it. Men like my father and Nathan had spent years conditioning the executives under them to believe in cutthroat business tactics, to prioritize power over people. So when I started making real changes, there was pushback. Whispers spread through the company. People doubted me. Some tried to undermine me, hoping I would stumble. Nathan especially refused to go down quietly. One afternoon, he barged into my office, his face twisted in frustration. You think you can just waltz in here and erase everything Dad built? I didn't even look up from my desk. I don't think, Nathan. I know. His hand slammed onto my desk. This isn't some fairy tale, Vivian. You're making enemies. The people you're firing, they have connections. You're playing a dangerous game. I finally met his gaze. The only dangerous game was the one you played, screwing over employees, bribing officials, covering up illegal deals. His nostrils flared. This company was never meant to be yours. I stood slowly, leaning forward just enough that he could see the steel in my eyes. And yet, I whispered, "Here I am." Nathan clenched his jaw, his fists trembling at his sides. He was losing, and he hated it. Without another word, he turned and stormed out. I watched him go, my heart steady. Let him fight. Let them all fight. Because I wasn't going anywhere. It didn't happen overnight, but over the next few months, I started seeing the shifts. Employees who had once walked on eggshells under my father now smiled when they passed me in the halls. Managers who had been afraid to speak up about corruption finally had a voice. People who had been dismissed as expendable were thriving. I visited the lower floors of the building, the places my father never dared to step foot in. I sat with the interns, listened to the customer service team, spoke to the factory workers who made this company what it was. And for the first time in this company's history, they felt seen. One of the older employees, a woman who had been with the company for 20 years, pulled me aside one day. "I worked under your father for a long time," she admitted, wringing her hands. "And I never thought I'd say this, but thank you." I blinked, caught off guard. "For what?" She smiled softly. "For proving that the Montclair name doesn't have to be a curse. My father's downfall wasn't as dramatic as I once imagined. There was no grand explosion, no violent reckoning. It was quiet, slow, inevitable. His influence waned. His name, once spoken with power and authority, became nothing more than a shadow of the past. He had spent his entire life building an empire of fear. But fear is a weak foundation, and when it crumbles, there's nothing left. One evening, I received a phone call. His voice, once so strong, was hollow. "You ruined me." I closed my eyes. "No, Dad. You ruined yourself." Silence. And then the line went dead. I never heard from him again. People assumed that because I had won, I would become ruthless, that I would take pleasure in watching my enemies suffer. But the truth, I didn't need to destroy them. I was better than that. Instead of seeking revenge, I sought growth. I started investing in small businesses. I opened scholarship programs for underprivileged students. I used my power not to crush, but to lift others up. And that was the greatest victory of all. Months passed before I saw Nathan again. He arrived unannounced, standing in the doorway of my office, looking more lost than I had ever seen him. For the first time, there was no anger in his expression, just exhaustion. "You were right," he murmured. I arched a brow. "About what?" His throat bobbed as he swallowed. "Everything." He hesitated, then with great difficulty forced the words out. "I don't know how to start over." I studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, I exhaled. "Then let's figure it out." Because I had won, but that didn't mean I had to let him lose. Years later, I stood in the very building that once symbolized my father's greed. Now, it was a company built on integrity. I had built something stronger than wealth, respect. And as I watched employees pass by, laughing, happy, fulfilled, I knew I had beaten him. Not by revenge, not by power, but by becoming someone he never could be. The last time I saw my father, he was nothing but a shadow of the man he once was. He looked at me, eyes hollow. I lost everything, he whispered. I tilted my head. No, Dad, I said softly. You threw everything away. And with that, I turned and walked away, because I had already won. And now it was time to move forward. The story of Vivian Montclair teaches us that true power isn't about control or fear. It's about resilience, integrity, and the courage to build something better. Revenge may feel satisfying for a moment, but real victory comes from proving your worth through success and positive change. In the end, those who underestimate you will have no choice but to acknowledge your strength. Thank you for watching my channel, and don't forget to check out more exciting and inspiring videos. Stay tuned for more stories that will motivate and empower you. The king's eyes burned with anger. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. In front of him, Sister Lamy stood shaking, wrapped in her simple white cloth. The air was thick with tension, a mixture of fear and curiosity hanging in the grand hall. Four men pointed at her, their voices filled with conviction and outrage, shouting, "Your Majesty, she has done something terrible, something shameful, with an animal." Gasps filled the room. The villagers whispered in shock, their expressions shifting from disbelief to horror. The king's face grew even darker as he processed the accusation, his fingers tapping slowly on the armrest of his golden throne. "Sister Lamy," he said, his voice like ice, his gaze piercing through her. "Tell me the truth. Did you do this?" The nun opened her mouth, her lips trembling, but then something strange happened. Her eyes moved, scanning the faces in the crowd. The flickering torchlight cast shifting shadows on the walls, making everything feel even more ominous. Her trembling hand lifted and pointed at someone in the crowd. The whole court froze, eyes widening, breaths held. Who was she pointing at? What secret was about to be revealed? Stay with me as we uncover the shocking truth and what happened next. A long time ago, in the kingdom of Amuna, there lived a kind nun named Sister Lamy. She was known for her gentle heart and love for people. Every morning, she would wake with the first light, stepping out of her small house near the church to tend to the sick and feed the poor. The villagers adored her, often bringing her small gifts of fruits and grains as a token of appreciation for her kindness. She spent her evenings in prayer, her soft voice blending with the rustling of leaves outside her window. One day, four men, Idris, Is, Bala, and Obi, stormed into the king's palace, their faces twisted in fury. Their clothes were dusty from travel, and sweat dripped from their brows. "Your Majesty," Idris shouted, his voice loud enough to shake the very foundations of the palace. "We have come to report a great sin." The king raised an eyebrow, his fingers now still. "What sin?" Easy pointed in the distance, his hand shaking with supposed disgust. "Sister Lamy. She has been doing terrible things with an animal, a dog." The court gasped. Whispers spread like wildfire, like dry leaves catching flame. Some of the elders shook their heads, their faces tight with disbelief. King Dyke's face turned dark with anger, his fingers now clenching into a fist. "Bring her to me at once," he commanded, his deep voice echoing through the grand hall. Guards rushed to Sister Lamy's home, their heavy footsteps thundering down the village path. She was inside, reading her Bible, when the sharp knock at the door startled her. Before she could respond, the door swung open and hands grabbed her arms roughly, dragging her out into the night. "What is happening? Why am I being taken?" she cried out, her voice laced with confusion and fear. But no one answered. Sister Lammy was dragged into the palace, her feet barely touching the ground as the guards pulled her forward. The grand hall was packed with people, villagers, palace guards, nobles and elders, all gathered to witness what was about to unfold. The golden throne gleamed under the torchlight, and there sat King Dyke, his face like stone, his eyes filled with judgment. The banners of the kingdom swayed slightly from a breeze, slipping in through the tall windows. The air smelled of burning incense and sweat. The four men, Idris, Ezi, Bala, and Obi, stood tall, their faces full of confidence. They had spoken, and now the king would pass judgment. Sister Lammy looked around, her heart pounding in her chest. The stares of the villagers burned into her skin like fire. They were not looking at her as a woman of God anymore. They were looking at her as a disgrace. The king leaned forward, his voice slow and powerful. "Sister Lammy, these men have accused you of a shameful act. Tell me the truth." A hush fell over the crowd. Even the wind outside seemed to pause in anticipation. Sister Lammy's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she could not speak. Her lips trembled. Her knees felt weak. But she had to defend herself. "Your Majesty, I have done nothing wrong. These are lies," she declared, her voice quivering but firm. The king's eyes narrowed. He studied her closely, looking for any sign of deception. He spoke again, his voice colder now. "If you are innocent, you will not fear an examination." A murmur spread through the court. Some villagers exchanged nervous glances, while others nodded in grim agreement. Sister Lammy swallowed hard. An examination? Was this how far they would go? The king turned to the royal midwife. "Mama Nui, examine her." Gasps echoed through the hall. Mama Nui, an elderly woman with years of wisdom, stepped forward. Her wrinkled hands were steady, her eyes sharp. She had seen many things in her life. But this was different. She reached for Sister Lammy's hand. "Come, my child," she whispered, leading her away. Sister Lammy followed, her heart racing. She had done nothing wrong, but she felt like a criminal walking to her execution. The hallway leading to the examination room was dimly lit, the flickering torchlight casting eerie shadows on the stone walls. She could hear the distant sounds of the villagers whispering, their voices growing into a hum of speculation and judgment. The court was silent as they waited. The only sound was the flickering of torches and the occasional whisper of the wind through the palace windows. Minutes passed, then, at last, minutes passed, then, at last, Mama Nui returned. Her face was pale, her lips pressed together as if she had seen a ghost. She walked slowly toward the king, her hands trembling. Then she bowed. "Your Majesty," she took a deep breath. "I have seen strange marks on her body." The moment those words left her lips, the courtroom exploded. Gasps, shouts, whispers, fingers pointed at Sister Lammy. "Did you hear that? She has marks! Then it must be true!" The king raised a hand and silence fell once more. His gaze locked onto Sister Lamy, his voice dangerously low. Why do you have these marks? Why do you have these marks? Sister Lamy's whole body felt cold. She looked down at her hands. They were shaking. She